Kia ora koutou, welcome to Lunch on the Way. I'm Joey, joined by Jonathan, and not Graham today because he is doing, work.
Real stuff.
He's doing real stuff, shaping the minds of students in the classroom and making an impact on the world, unlike us who just talk into a microphone.
Yeah. But it means Dad's away, so we can do what we want.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, we don't have his prying glare.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Graham's very permission-giving and is very relaxed. For somebody who's a boomer.
Yeah, that's right.
Just kidding. Thanks so much for listening to this episode, and don't forget to
like and subscribe on YouTube.
And if you're listening to this on audio, don't forget to follow and rate.
We really appreciate your listening. All right, good, Jonathan. So today, usually
we're in your hands, Joey.
You're in my hands.
Yeah, that's going to be good and dangerous and
dangerous.
Right on the edge.
No, you're the dangerous one.
Oh, yeah,
you're
right
the person
on the edge, man.
You're the person who always takes things.
Let's get on the edge.
Yeah, exactly. So here we go. So I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and it was talking about tensions, and it really got me thinking. Mostly tensions in ministry and organizations, but it got me thinking about people's understanding of tensions. I don't mean like tensions in relationships or tensions in like maybe internally. I'm talking about things that you can't problem solve out. That they're just always going to be there. You can't get rid of them, and if you get rid of them, you end up creating more problems than you had with just the tension. So I'll tell you what I was listening to. Yeah. I don't normally listen to this podcast, but once in a while I'm like, you know what? Andy Stanley, this guy in the U.S., he comes out with some good stuff.
I know that name.
Yeah, he's most people in the U.S. know who he is if they're in church stuff.
Right.
And anyway, so he was talking about mostly organizational tensions, and he didn't talk about anything specifically, but just about the principles of how it's the leader's role to manage tensions within an organization. And you shouldn't solve tensions. You should just be aware of them and shift accordingly. And an example he used was in the family, where he said, well, usually around the family schedule, it's not a problem to solve, it's a tension to manage. Because life is always changing, things are always adapting, and you have to be aware of what needs to change. Where one spouse might say, "Hey, I just want to deal with this now, so we don't have to deal with it ever again." And then the other spouse, maybe a month later, is like, "I think we need to talk about the schedule again." And then the first one is like, "I thought we dealt with this already." Right. It's like, well, no, it's not a problem to solve; it's a tension to manage. And that's kind of his illustration he used to describe different tensions.
Got you.
Yep. So, but I don't want to talk about what he talked about.
Okay.
I want to switch it a little bit.
Okay.
I want to talk about maybe theological tensions, practical tensions, internal Christian discipleship tensions.
Yeah.
That we sometimes see as problems, but really they're just tensions to manage as opposed to problems to solve.
Okay.
And if you try and solve these problems, you're creating tensions, you're creating more problems. As a result.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And just as a level of inspiration, we'll just start with maybe one.
Yeah.
And we'll go from there. And
Okay.
I think, honestly, I think the conversation will
Yeah.
take care of itself after this.
Yep.
But the standard tension most churches find themselves in is how wide do you go versus how deep do you go?
Yep.
That's like the perennial tension of who's in the room or who's in the congregation. How do I serve these people well? Some people, you can't go particularly deep.
Yeah.
Some people, that's all they want is to go deep. They don't want to go wide.
Yeah.
But as somebody, you're in the church world as a pastor as well, or even as somebody who's leading really anything where there's a small group or whatever. It's like that seems like a classic tension.
That's so true.
What's been your experience with that tension?
I mean, it's right. I mean, I was just thinking about this on the way in here today, and
you
thinking
were?
about one of the tensions is, look, here's a preaching tension.
Yeah.
Maybe you find this too. People are like, hey man, I need more stories. How's this connect to my life? Just give me some more stories, and then you'll be like, yeah, okay, I'll add some like practical steps into my preaching now. And then the next person you talk to, probably the very next person is saying, hey man, you need more theology in there. You're like, speak about talk about the triune God and all this kind of stuff. And then they need completely different things. So there's a huge tension in there. So that's what you kind of mean,
That's
right?
what I'm kind of talking about.
You've come across that?
Yeah, I've come across that. I think what people maybe in more I don't want to say church growth, but I guess more Protestant denominations would say it's around, well, how attractional do you need to be versus how discipleship do you need to be?
Yeah.
You
Is
know?
church outward focusing or is it inward focusing? Are we preaching or setting out the church for people that have never been to church?
Yeah.
Or are we talking to insiders already? So that's another tension.
Yeah.
The other one is, I mean, in my denomination, Anglicanism would be, how liturgical should we be?
Okay.
So there's a real tension in there. There's the high liturgical, and then there's the more kind of contemporary, charismatic kind of service as well. That's an inner tension as
Another
well.
tension, if we're just going to list a bunch off.
Yeah, list them.
Another tension within church world is how many new songs versus how many old songs.
Oh yeah, that's good.
You know?
That's a goodie too.
That's a passionate
That's a
one.
good one,
People
man.
get passionate about that one, and I understand that one because I'm like, yeah, it's important to have new songs, but a part of me is like, I think it's as I get older, I'm like, just give me the old deep tracks, the old bangers.
That's so funny.
I'm like, give me those "Be Thou My Visions." Come on,
That's so funny.
Or
yeah,
what's "Open the Eyes of My"?
Yeah, oh yeah.
I'm like, yes, please.
Oh, dude.
Or but that's But
okay, what about theology? I mean, classic off the top of my head, systematics versus practical theology.
Yep,
that's a huge tension.
And then there's
it can be.
There's a trichotomy or tritension, if you will. Biblical theology.
Oh, biblical theology.
Versus systematic versus practical. So systematic, if you're listening, you're like, what the flip are they talking about? Systematic has to do with categorizing doctrinally the biblical data, if you will. Like, what does the Bible say about the humanity of Christ? Yeah. That's a systematic kind of question. A biblical theology type of question would be, who is Jesus in relation to the story of the Bible, or in relation to Abraham or Moses, and how does it all connect together?
Yeah.
It's more of a narratival look at the Bible. And then there's practical, which is, well, how does this actually relate to my lived experience, and how does it inform how I follow Jesus?
Yep.
And so why is there a tension there?
Well, often there, I think there can be a tension of hierarchy. It's like if we get all the theology sorted, like a systematics, and if we can lay it all out, then we'll know the truth of it.
Yeah.
And the practical is always saying, but how does that play out in our real lives? And then it gets a little bit more messy. And it's not just about laying out the systematics. It's got to be practically usable in our own experience. Yeah. I don't know. That's how I would kind of start to get to it. What would you say?
I think you're right, and because every single one of those tensions, and there's more methodologies of theology than just those three. All those tensions assume that this is the way you ought to look at the Bible. But in reality, you should probably use all of them or view the scriptures through particular different lenses.
So would that be
at different times?
Yeah. So if we stay with that one, then would you say, if we sorted that out, if we took away the tension and just went with one, would that be a problem?
That would be a problem,
okay.
Jonathan. That exactly is a problem.
Yeah.
You're right, that'd be a problem, because what it would do is it would make you very narrow-minded and focused. So an example would be, biblical theology does a great job connecting all the dots of Scripture. It's like, okay, so Moses, to Joshua, exile to Jesus, and you're like, then Paul.
We can see how this all fits together.
You see how it all fits together. But if you only viewed the Scriptures through a biblical theological lens, which is this, if you're wondering, well, who actually does this? The Bible Project does this. This is their primary way of viewing Scripture.
Right.
N.T. Wright, his primary way of viewing Scripture is through a biblical theological lens. If you only view Scripture through that lens, or if you only view your theology proper through that lens, it's very reductionistic.
Right.
Because it doesn't really get into the weeds of the implications of the story.
Yep.
It's like, it's great that, Jesus is the new Moses, and you can certainly drive a lot of theology around that through the story of the Bible. But what does it mean that Jesus is greater than Moses?
Right.
Like that question, the systematic theologians just run with.
Yep.
And they're like,
And then then systematics would want to pull above the text a little bit more and say, okay, well, what about the Trinity? What can we say that the Bible is saying about the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, which is super, key, the key central theme for Christianity. And so how do we think about that? How has the tradition thought about that? How can we lay this out in a way that's coherent, that people can understand it and really wrap their head around, make that the central thing of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
That's what systematic is, want to just come above the text a little bit more, jump out of that narrative just a little bit, and kind of grab hold of the concept and talk about it. And then the practical's always saying, yeah, okay, but how do we see this playing out?
Yeah.
How do we see it playing out in our lives?
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be super important because we're embodied people.
But you got to wrap all those tensions kind of together. You got to, I think of, have you ever slacklined before?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've slacklined?
No, never have
No?
done it.
Okay.
Nah.
Okay. My friends and I were really into it, my late teens and early 20s.
Looks like a good way to hurt yourself.
Well, I didn't go. I only went up very high a few times.
Yeah.
But you're harnessed in and you're fine. But mostly it's just off the ground. But it's a line.
Yeah.
And there's tension in the line.
Yes.
And you don't want the tension to be too loose.
Yes.
Or else it's so wobbly that it's very difficult to balance.
Mm-hmm.
But you also don't want it too tight because you need a little bit of wobble.
Yep.
In order to actually feel your center of gravity and balance.
Yep.
If it's just a rod, that's very difficult to balance on. But
Yep.
if it's, just slack, that's very difficult to balance on.
Yep.
So I kind of think of tensions,
Yep.
if I use that metaphor, the same way within theology and within most of life. If it's not a problem, if it's a tension, it's always trying to figure out where is that sweet spot.
Yep.
And it's almost, that sweet spot's elusive.
Yep.
And I know we just talked about theology, but you can think of this in almost every aspect of
you
life.
can. Yeah.
This is when people talk about in life, I just want to live a balanced life.
Mm-hmm.
What they're really saying is I have a bunch of tensions in my life, and I want to solve a problem.
Yeah.
And I think the best way to solve a problem is to figure out a template, look what other people are doing, and then get it just calibrated right.
Yeah.
But then what happens? The next week looks different than the week before.
Yeah.
And the tension's all out of whack.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a soapbox I'm going to speak on for a second.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing as balance in life. It's a tension to manage.
Yep.
And the same is true with the Christian life, and the same is true with living in church, your job, everything.
Yeah.
So it's about tensions.
point.
It's about managing
Yeah,
it,
that's a good point.
and it's about trying to find that sweet spot, knowing you probably won't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's okay.
Yep.
Anyway,
Yeah. I'm trying to think of more.
I got tons.
Yeah.
I got tons.
Lay some
Yeah,
some down.
I got my laptop.
I mean, one of the other ones I think is maybe this is prayer rather than kind of going out and doing stuff. So there's that tension there between those two things. Are we prayers or are we doers?
True.
What are we?
You know where that comes through? And
Yeah.
I don't know who has done this quote, who first said this, but I'm going to pray I'm going to live like it all depends on me, and I'm going to pray like it all depends on God.
Right. Okay.
And I'm like, that sounds so great.
That sounds like a leadership book.
It is. I think it's an American dude said that first.
Yeah.
But I was like, man, that sounds nice. But a part of me is like, well, if I actually embody that I'm actually a bit out of whack still.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I live and work and hustle and,
Yeah.
and grind, just work hard,
Yeah.
like it all depends on me.
Yeah.
And I can say that I'm going to pray like it all depends on God,
Yeah.
but I think one takes over.
Yeah.
And it's probably the hustle one,
Yeah.
to be honest, takes over
Yep.
in that situation.
Yep.
So how do you even...
That's a really good
Yeah.
point. It makes me think of here's another theological one. Salvation. Do we work out our salvation, or are we saved by faith alone? You
Yeah.
know, which one is that? That's another little classic one. In my world, there's a tension between philosophy and theology.
Yeah.
Which one's more important?
I don't... gosh.
Yeah, there's so many little tensions. Yeah, exactly right.
And I
It's
don't...
really interesting when you start getting down to it.
See, and as we're talking right now,
Yeah.
my brain is like, solve these tensions for people listening right now.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't... that's not right.
yeah.
Because when you said, okay, what matters more? What was this discipleship one? No.
Prayer?
So working at your salvation.
Yep.
Is it how much of it is you and
Yep.
how much of it is God?
Mm-hmm.
That was actually the topic we were going to try and.
Oh,
talk
really?
about today
That we're
a little
gonna
bit.
lead into?
Yeah, because that person. We won't talk about it today because
Right,
it's
right.
a big can of worms.
Yeah,
but essentially, this
yeah,
person
yeah.
disagrees with the modern discipleship.
That's right. That's right.
Discipleship terminology for Christian formation because it's really Pelagian.
Yeah, right.
What
exactly.
I mean is it's all about you
Yep.
doing things.
That's right.
To be transformed by God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, hold up. That tension seems a bit out of whack there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is God.
Yep.
And it's not just maybe modern psychological, neurological, transformative habit changes
Yep.
that will get you to where Jesus wants you to go.
Yeah.
Because only Jesus can get you there. Yeah, that's a big tension. Philosophy and theology, that's been one since the very beginning.
It has, right from the beginning.
How much of Plato and Aristotle do we need to put in our theology?
That's right.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be there
and
at all.
It's in there a lot.
Yeah, that's right.
The fact that people think when they go to heaven that they're going to be disembodied and kind of just like one with God in that sense, that is not what the Bible says at all.
Yep.
But that's very Platonic.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yep. So, there's tension there.
So there's tensions. So what I want to do, maybe, because we just kind of brushed over the surface, what I want to do is talk more about the actual tensions that we contextually find ourselves in right now.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking more maybe on like a church end of like, if this makes sense, being the church, or, helping the church, or being a leader in the church.
Yeah. Or
being somebody who is a part of church. Like what personally are some of the tensions that you find yourself having to manage right now?
Mm-hmm.
And I know we don't want to necessarily be too self-revealing.
Yeah.
But I think it would be helpful just to note a few of them. And I think one of the biggest tensions, if I want to start,
jump in,
is what really started this podcast, for me at least, was, as I look at the graphics up on the TV screen, was we needed a moment. There's a tension of how much do you need to think before you go and do.
Okay.
And I felt like within most of my ministry practice for a decade, it was a lot of just doing. Mm-hmm. And the doing was implicit within all the methodologies and all the models that different church leaders and authors and scholars and not so scholarly people were proposing, and that were just assumed because everything was just assumed, and we should move the church in this direction because this is the way we've always been doing it.
Yep.
And it was COVID that kind of made myself and a lot of people realize, we need to think a bit more. There's a tension there. It's not that you need to stop doing to begin to think, but how much do you allow yourself to think or reflect on your ministry practice and what you do, not only theologically, but practically speaking, into your current practice?
Yeah.
How do you actually implement those things? How do you bring people along on a, if you will, a methodological shift? And that's the one that was really in my face around 2022, 2021.
That's good. Yeah.
Around the end of there.
Yep.
And I'm still living in that tension.
Yeah.
I'm probably more into the thinking space at the moment.
Yeah.
And just chilling out on the doing for a moment.
Okay.
Because
you strike me as quite a doer.
Yeah.
So this is quite a shift for you.
It is a shift. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mostly because I think the default with pastors is just, all right, I've been thinking for a week now.
Yeah.
Let's go do it.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's the default, where I think sometimes we just need to sit with an idea. Yeah, keep doing what you're doing for sure, but at some point you need to think deeply to make a shift.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the timeline is on that, how what that process looks like, but I know I'm not the only one in that.
Yeah.
That tension of reflecting versus doing.
Yep.
And
that's a huge tension for pastors, though, right? I mean, you as a pastor, because your congregation looks to you like, what are you doing? And it looks like you're just sitting on your hands if you're not constantly doing something for the church, doing something, leading them, setting the vision. As soon as you take your foot off the gas, you start to worry that you're going to lose people, that you're not being relevant, that you're not really saying anything, that you're not pastoring properly, right?
Yeah.
So that's a huge tension for pastors, and no wonder they just keep on going.
Oh, I get it.
Without reflecting.
Yeah.
Because that time of reflection, I think, is super important. But yes, it's very difficult when you're leading a group of people.
Yeah. Well, it's like when there's a power vacuum. We talked about that around power a little bit. When there's a power vacuum, people try and assert their own power into situations. I think the same is true within a church if there's a perceived vision vacuum.
Yeah, exactly.
Where are we going? What are we aiming for?
That's right.
Are you not thinking about this? Because I'm thinking. All of us are thinking about this.
Yeah.
And then somebody potentially comes in.
Yep.
And asserts their own vision. Yep. Which is like the worst nightmare for someone who's leading anything.
Yep.
Because it's like, oh, hold up.
Yeah, that's
hold
right.
up. Unless they present a compelling vision of we're trying to think deeply about our next steps.
Yep.
But
okay, so So you think that tension can be held, and it's important to hold that tension,
I
or do
think
you
so.
think it needs to be resolved at some point?
No, I don't think it's a problem to be solved.
It's a perennial thing.
No,
It'll keep on going. We'll always be having to reflect and always be having to move forward.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So how do we hold that?
No,
how do we hold that
That's
tension?
a good question, because I think if you see it as a problem to be solved, the deep thinking versus the active doing.
Yeah.
If you think it's a problem to be solved, then you're going to value one over the other and say, or you're going to think, yep, job done.
Yep.
I've thought about it.
Yep.
Now I'm just going to go and do.
Yeah.
But-
And that's a resolving of the tension, right?
And that's
okay,
resolving.
I'm doing it now.
We figured it out, guys.
Yeah, okay.
We know what we're all about.
Yep.
We know what the church is.
Yep.
And we're going to embody it. And this is us forever.
Yep.
That's not true. Maybe it could be true for a year, a few years, I wouldn't say any longer than that.
Yep.
But I think it's a tension to manage, because you always need to constantly reflect on what's going on.
Yep.
So I'm going to explain. This is more academic, and we just talked about this before we started recording. There's actually a practical theological methodology around this.
Okay.
And I didn't know these things existed. It's more intuitive, really, than people give it credit for, but it's good to at least have this framework in mind. And then while I'm saying this, maybe you think of your own tension.
I've got
All right,
one.
You got one? All right.
Yeah.
So I'll finish this thought and we'll go to you.
Yeah.
So it's around this praxis cycle.
Yeah.
Where you identify a problem or tension or
Yep.
a problem. You then look at the context.
Yep.
You try and figure out, okay, what's really going on here. You probably bring in different disciplines, maybe psychology or cultural anthropology or whatever, to kind of figure out what's actually at play with this problem. Then you bring scripture in to reflect on it theologically. You propose a framework for a new way forward. You then implement that. And then in the implementation, after the implementation or during the implementation, you're always reflecting.
Yep.
To try and identify a new problem. Like, okay, did it solve the initial problem or did it present more problems?
Yep.
And it's in that last phase of reflection, you begin the process all over again. It's cyclical.
Yep. Yep.
So that's actually the process. It's intuitive. Like what I just described is an intuitive way that anyone who leads anything you would expect in a pastoral manner or church leadership manner would go about. But oftentimes once we implement that new thing, we stop the reflection.
Yeah.
And we say, problem solved.
Yeah.
And I think very often we need to always be evaluating, always be tweaking, because, and that's the tension between doing and reflecting.
Yes.
It's like you're building the plane while it's flying.
Yeah.
And you're modifying it while it's in the air.
Yep.
And that's the tension.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the background to all this is that tension, that is just simply the way of life.
Yeah.
Like that tension will never be solved. So stop trying to fight against it.
Yeah.
Give yourself over to it and then do it well.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you mean?
I think so. And be okay with, be okay with never arriving.
Right.
Because you never arrive with tensions.
Yep.
Because there's a theological reason for that. We live in a already not yet world because of Jesus. Well, because of us, and then Jesus solved it.
Yeah.
But we live in this tension now.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be that until, Christ comes again. And I don't really know what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
So who knows what tensions are presented after that?
That's a good point. Yeah.
So
I feel like I want to give the Big Lebowski quote.
What's that?
It's the journey, man.
Oh, gosh. It's the journey.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it is. Cliche as it is the journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably more of my ministry philosophy now.
Yeah.
It's more about the journey than the destination. It's more about the tensions than the problems.
Yeah. I mean, in many kind of ways, if we're going to come back to scripture, Paul is saying a very similar thing where he's saying, run the race.
Yeah.
The race is the most important thing. If you're a pastor, it's the race that you're wanting to keep people on this track. You're wanting to make sure they're healthy along the way and grow them, of course, along the way, but it's to keep them on the track.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of reflection. Are we running the right race? Are we got the right uniform on? Are we moving in the right direction? And that's a constant rethinking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the finish line is when you're dead.
Well,
or
pretty
the
much.
resurrection.
100%.
Yeah, that's the finish line.
100%.
So it's like, all right, you
Yeah.
want to get to the destination?
That's right. Yeah. 500 people in your church is not the destination.
No. No.
Yeah.
It's much bigger and grander than
Yeah. That you preached a great sermon last Sunday was not the destination.
Yeah.
Fantastic. But that's not the end. You've still got,
Yeah.
you need to keep going. Yeah.
That's good.
Okay, here's my tension. You ready for it?
Probably not.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, here's the tension. I've been thinking about. It is. I mean, I think this has been going on for a long time. And how much do we listen to voices from overseas?
Oh my gosh.
And
I'm one of those voices.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Keep
How
going.
much do we listen to the popular voices at the moment? And how much do we should we be paying attention to them? What the kind of insights that they're bringing, and then how much then should we be listening to the people that are already in our congregations, the people that are already moving in our circles and our context? How much should we be giving them a bit more airtime?
Yeah,
and listening to them and I bring this up because I mean YouTube's a classic thing.
Yeah,
a lot of people are listening to voices of great people overseas, and they're doing some good things. But is it right for us? And is it right for our context? And is it right for our congregations?
Yeah.
And again, there's a tension.
There's a tension. All right.
And I don't know how to resolve. I don't know how to resolve that, because a lot of my greatest, kind of insights have come from reading books from people overseas.
Yeah.
That are speaking to huge audiences.
Yeah.
But then more and more as I get older, I think, what about the people around me? I don't listen to them.
No.
And those are the people that know me best. And those are the people that know my context best.
Yeah.
So there's a tension there for me. And maybe what you just said, it shouldn't be resolved. I need to live in that tension. That'll always be the case. That big voices will rise to the top and they'll speak to the world. And that's okay. But so often I tend to give more credence to those voices than I do to the people sitting right next to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. But what I think you've identified is the tension's out of whack.
Yeah,
That's what's clear.
That's what it feels like.
The slack line is too loose.
Yeah, the slack line's loose.
The slack line's loose. You need to tighten it up a little bit to find that sweet spot.
Yeah.
And I think the sweet spot is clearly not close, because New Zealand... Because what you just identified, I think, is not only you personally, with your different inputs from philosophy and theology and church practice, and Christian formation, all these things, international voices. There's that, but then you go all the way up, if you will, to church as organization, or church as community of people, or church as a scholar community.
That's right.
It goes all the way up.
Yeah.
And I think New Zealand is deeply under-resourced to be able to have that kind of output. Resourced is in like...
But then
I don't mean like monetarily, where that's true.
No, I see what you're saying.
What I mean is like for example, an American ethos is like, we can do it. Yeah. And because of that, they just go and do it. Yeah. Where I feel like more of a Kiwi disposition, and sometimes Canadian, is, can we do our own thing? Yeah. Can we?
But see, that's the perception, that we're deeply under-resourced with good thinkers or good people that can do this kind of work, or can think more broadly. That's the perception, and I think it's false.
Yeah, it probably is.
I think it's incredibly false, and this is why we're out of whack. Yeah. And why do we fly in people from overseas?
Yeah.
That are the flavor of the month. Yeah. Sure, and I wouldn't want to say they're not giving great insight and they're not bringing good things to the table, but they become the main voice.
Yeah, they do.
But they're speaking into a completely different context.
I think our tensions parallel each other,
and we think, it's a spiritual context. Everyone can learn from this, and I'm thinking, well, I'm not so sure.
Well, I'm like, that's a classic example of bringing a speaker in to speak into this context who knows nothing about this context, to be completely honest. Yeah,
and I'll give the other side of this, because I don't want to say this is all one-sided, because I can see
there's the tension.
There's the tension here, because there's some good things that can come from it.
Exactly. You need an outside voice to speak in.
Sometimes it breaks things open. 100%.
You 100% need that, but like I just said, the tension's a bit out of whack, I think.
Yeah.
So this is where I think the whole reflection action thing is so important.
Yep. And I think we've been in this for years in this cycle. So I wouldn't want to say this is just
Dude, we've been in this for decades.
Decades.
And I felt this in
100%.
Canada too, where I'm like, we're just like in the East Coast of Canada in particular, we're just doing what the bigger places, bigger churches are doing.
That's right.
But this is where I think education is so important. This is like this is why I think going to university is so valuable. I don't think it's valuable because of potentially having a higher paying job, because that's increasingly becoming not true.
Right.
You could be a plumber, a carpenter, not to say those are skilled jobs, but they don't require a 4 or 3 year degree plus masters. They require an apprenticeship and all that kind of stuff. But it's so important to go to university because it begins to help you think critically.
Yeah, sure. Gotcha.
If you have, a good
that's
good
a great
system.
point. That's a good point.
It's that critical thought, because now whenever I see somebody internationally or somebody outside of the context I'm in forming my context, I need to pause always and say, I can't buy this wholesale. I can gather the good thoughts, the good principles, but I need to do the critical thinking of contextualizing this.
Yeah, okay.
And throwing out potentially something that will not fit this context.
Yeah.
Where I think a lot of people, especially people who are leading churches who haven't had an education that allows them to begin to think about this. It's not to say you can't acquire that over time. You certainly can.
Yeah.
Just by experience, I think you can. No doubt. It's not a one-size-fits-all scenario on how to think better. However, to read the latest book and to implement that wholesale into your context, that's probably not the best move to go, especially because there's a whole list of presuppositions. So an example would be around, let's say around the biggest shift in church culture has been church small groups. Let's say that, for example, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of that stuff came initially from a Wesleyan understanding of band groups or of small groups, but it then was forgotten over time and then morphed into the church growth movement of how do we actually make church smaller as we grow bigger? Well, it's small groups. And it was mostly an American context that came out of, and mostly a suburban context. And there's a whole list of presuppositions and contextual considerations based on that. And it's not to say small groups are bad. Certainly not. It's great for people to get together. That's not what I'm saying at all.
And there's the tension as
but
well. So
it's important to realize, why would we need this? What problems are we trying to solve, or what tensions are we trying to manage? And how can this, this idea of small group ministry be tailored in such a way that it makes sense for our context?
Yeah.
So, for example, when you live in a monocultural environment, which a lot of, I don't know so much anymore, but certainly a decade or more ago in the U.S., that was the case.
Yeah.
Mostly white people lived in the suburbs of the cities.
Yep.
And so to have an integration of different people from the church into different small groups was a bit easier. The only thing you really had to worry about was maybe socioeconomic standing.
Right.
Dentists versus, people who didn't have high qualified jobs. And that would be the only tension to manage, and relatability and all that stuff. But now you come into Auckland, and especially the church I'm a part of, there's a whole host of cultural considerations.
Right.
Because there's assumptions within each culture within the church as to how does community work.
Yep.
And to do a small group environment within, say, a white Pakeha context is different than a Pacific Island context.
Got you.
There's different expectations, and there's, so like if someone has a death in the family in your small group, there's a whole host of expectations that are very different.
Yep.
Where one person might not feel like they're being served well at all, but then people who are part of that group are like, well, we just want to give you your space.
Yep.
So it's just, it complicates things.
Yep.
And so it's not to say that is not a good thing to bring small groups into your context, but how you actually do that is radically different compared to its original context that, say, that book or that idea came out of.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a long way of
small groups.
Small groups. I don't know. What other things are you thinking around that?
I don't know. I see some of the tensions. I think an outside speaker can bring a broader view to the situation that you're currently in, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So it can broaden your horizons. It can also highlight things that maybe have been forgotten about in your context, which are super important, which is great. On the other side, though, I think it can it can stop you from doing the critical work yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So you start just relying on other people coming up with ideas for what your church needs, and you just kind of clock out.
You outsource it.
Yeah, you're outsourcing your own thinking, you're outsourcing your own spirituality. You're letting someone else in many kind of ways run your church and run your congregation and pastor people that you are supposed to be pastoring.
Yep.
I think that can be a huge problem.
Dang.
Yeah, that's pretty bomb droppy, eh?
Yeah, it is.
Are you pastoring the people that you have been given to pastor, or are you letting the latest speaker pastor your people?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question, and that's a tension, because you need to listen to voices that maybe have done the work deeper that you have done. That's okay. We can't all go deep in all areas of our lives. That we just can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So you look to other people that are experts. Great, that's fantastic. But don't let that be the only voice that you listen to.
No.
You should be listening to what God is wanting to do in your context. So there again, there's that other tension. Also, I think we can start putting, classically we start putting certain people on pedestals.
Yeah.
And the information and the kind of teaching that they're bringing into our context can change.
Yeah.
And that can cause all sorts of problems in your church. It raises questions that should not be being raised in your congregation. These are questions that are coming from the outside, and that causes havoc.
Yeah,
and so you need to watch out for that.
Yeah,
there's another tension. I mean, classically, and this person's not on the scene anymore, so it's probably okay to speak about him. Classic is Rob Bell.
Yeah, true.
In my mind,
yeah,
he became our voice for a certain generation of Christians.
Yeah.
He was the big voice that came in. And in many kind of ways, great. He cracked open a certain way of thinking theologically, which was fantastic. And it brought in a whole kind of new kind of fresh air, really, and excited many people. But it also brought in a whole lot of kind of thinking that just caused a whole lot of havoc in the churches that wasn't really, I don't think it was helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that's right.
So that's a huge tension. What kind of voices do we allow to speak into our lives?
Well, this is another. I don't think this is a tension. Well, it is. Everything's a tension. It seems like, all right, whatever. But I preached a sermon. I think 2 years ago or a year and a half ago on. I forget what the topic was, but it was more. I was talking about resources and input.
Right.
And I talked about how online is the Wild West.
Right.
And I kind of reinstantiated why it's actually important that you listen to the sermons, not to get a bit too full, but it's important that you listen to the contextualization of the word in this local congregation. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm not disagreeing that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't listen to things online. I listen to tons of things online.
Oh man, so do I.
I listen to.
So do I. That's
and that's outside perspective coming in. I think
definitely.
There's so much good stuff, but I said it's like the Wild West.
Yeah.
I said anybody like us with a microphone and a subscription online.
Let's talk about the ground we stand on.
Exactly. Yeah. Anybody can say anything.
Yeah.
And I said, not everything is fruitful, not everything is useful to listen to.
Absolutely.
So I said that's why a community is so important in church.
Yeah.
Because you shouldn't just listen to stuff, especially not just things about everything, but especially things about church theology, discipleship, following Jesus.
Yeah.
You shouldn't just listen to those things outside of community.
That's exactly right.
You need to be in it with other people. You need to present the things that you're learning to other people, because people will push back, or people will agree, or will change other people's perspectives, or your perspective will be changed based on what other people say.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the sermon, I listed off a few good things I listened to.
Yeah.
And I didn't list off some things I didn't think you should listen to, because I'm not that kind of person to do that. Mm-hmm. But I said, hey, if you're wondering what I think about certain things, or if you have recommendations for me, I'd love to listen to them. Yeah. I'm not going to say not listen to things. I'm just going to say we need to be in conversation about it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly where I was going with that, because I love the critical thinking thing that you just brought to the conversation a little while back. And I think whoever comes in, whatever you're listening to, be in conversation with them. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really healthy stance or posture towards outside voices. Say, okay, this is great. I love what you're bringing. What's it mean for me and my situation?
Yeah.
What about this question, which I am struggling with? Do you have how can you speak to that?
Yeah.
And push back. You don't have to be passive in this. You can have a voice in any conversation, even the people that are coming in from the outside.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They have no kind of authority over you. They're simply bringing a perspective, and you should be in conversation with them.
Yeah, they have no skin in the game with you.
No skin in the game, because they will leave.
Yeah,
exactly right.
They just pop in, pop out.
Yeah,
that's it. And it's important to understand that. I'll tell you an illustration. I hope this connects in somehow, or often just randomly talking about something.
Yeah.
I was listening to, here's a shout out to Wesleyan Methodist minister who has a podcast, Frank Ritchie.
Oh yeah.
The Recovering podcast.
Yeah,
so he interviews media personalities across the country. He's a media chaplain, has good relationships with people in the industry. Yeah. And I was listening to one the other day, or 2 days ago. I forget what the lady, what her name was, but it's probably the
Petra
last.
Baghurst?
That's it.
Yep.
You listen to it?
No, I know the one you mean though.
Yeah. You probably saw clips and stuff.
I did, yeah.
There was a bit at the last half where she talked about her experience in the COVID lockdown.
Right.
And I'll explain the situation a bit more, because obviously we were both in Auckland during that. So she said she found herself as a journalist and her husband in Auckland for all the lockdowns somehow, even though they're Wellington based. But they lived in Auckland as well. And it was the big one in 2021, starting in August, that went all the way to December, I think it was, like a crazy length. Mm-hmm. We'd be in it right now, I think, at the start of it was right about now, 3 years ago.
Wow.
But it was, so she was, I think, 6 or 7 weeks in it, but was able to go to Wellington to be in the press gallery because they needed her. So she got special permission to leave the bubble and to go to Wellington. And when she got to Wellington, she said how shocked she was at like the relative ambivalence of Wellington, the Wellingtonians, to what was going on in Auckland. It's like, whatever's happening in Auckland, we don't care.
Oh, wow.
And so she would go, she was living a normal life. It was quite the contrast of having what she would consider to be really illogical and dumb rules at the time.
Wow.
Because they just, as time went on, they made less and less sense.
Okay.
Which is what every single Aucklander was feeling over the course of 16 weeks.
Right.
Why are we doing this? We need to have a plan B. Right? And we all knew that because we were living in it. But the rest of the country wasn't thinking like that.
Okay.
So the context within the country had changed. Anyway, so she had realized when she went to the press gallery and, people were asking questions to Hipkins and Ardern, they were all low ball, underhanded questions where it's just like, they're just like letting them just like hit it out of the park. Right?
Yeah.
And because nobody in that press gallery and the MPs in the cabinet, even those who were MPs for Auckland, weren't living in Auckland, and they're making decisions for Auckland. So they're an outside voice coming in.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Without actually having the lived experience in that context. And so what she said is like, man, if they would have just lived in Auckland, like everyone in the cabinet for like a week and a half or even a week, they would have quickly realized they need to make some radical changes to the rules immediately.
Oh, that's interesting.
And not just hope that the cases will go down, because they won't.
Yeah.
Because people are already breaking the rules anyway. So I only say that story, one, because
it's a good analogy.
It reemerged some anger in me from 2021 of why are we doing this, But what she said is the context within Auckland and the reason for the last election is because of that lockdown, she said. And the people in the rest of the country really don't understand that. They didn't understand how angry Aucklanders really were.
Yeah.
And until the election happened, it was finally shown how angry they were.
Interesting.
And so her big point was you need to live in the context.
Yep.
To make the decisions. You need to contextualize your thoughts.
Yep.
Or else you're really speaking you're speaking and you're missing.
That's awesome.
And you're being misheard and people get upset and they get angry in this case. So I thought that was
I think that's really interesting, and it kind of comes back to some attention I saw with preaching. So do we tell more stories? Do we tell our preaching through stories, or do we tell it through just straight out theology?
Yeah.
Now that will, if you're listening to an outside voice that's saying it's only theology that you need, and you get in the pulpit and you only preach theology because the voice outside is telling you only preach theology, you only do, give them straight theological kind of talk.
Exposition of scripture, verse by verse by verse. Yeah.
And the people in your congregation are not at that stage.
Yeah.
Are you bringing the Spirit of God to those people? Are you pastoring them in the right way? Are you meeting them the needs that they have? The answer is probably no. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't just drop the outside voice and not preach straight out kind of theological concepts. But you need to bring into your thinking, because the situation itself is calling for a different disposition. It's calling for a different posture. And now I think that's the tension.
Mm-hmm.
What is the context saying? And where do you need to lead them?
Yeah.
So you need to meet people where they're at.
And you can only know that by being in the context. In there, by experiencing it.
Exactly right.
And if you want to be completely honest, the reason why certain passages kind of jump off the page to you is because of your intuitive sense of what the people need.
Exactly. And I always come back to that saying of Pope Francis, the pastor smells like the sheep.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because so often we do not want to smell like the people around us. We don't want to. We want to be so platonic and keep on lifting ourselves out of the context, because it's safe, it's clean, it's so easy to manage.
Yeah.
But when you put yourself back into your own context, it's freaking complicated, and it's frustrating, and you don't really know how to see a way through. You don't know how to pastor these people.
Yeah.
And at that point, I think you're really pastoring people.
Yeah, it is true. That's why, this is one of the reasons why I admire people who go into politics.
Yep.
Yes, there's reasons why you shouldn't admire people who go into politics, ego boosting and self-aggrandizing and all these different things. But you can't avoid the fact that people who run for office or want to become MPs or local councilors, they put themselves in the mud. They put themselves
That's a really good point.
They put themselves, they expose themselves, they get down. How am I going to describe this? They are not above reality.
Right.
They're going so into reality that they want to serve and address the real problems in society.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And because of that, they're going to receive enormous criticism because they're tampering with people's lived experience.
But
they don't mind getting messy in that lived experience.
Man, that's a really good point.
So if you link it to pastoral ministry or even just being a Christian in general, to be honest, it's, to really, this is why all of Paul's letters end with important imperatives for Christian living. They all point to living in the context, in the experience of others, working through the tensions, forgiving when things have gone wrong. It's getting messy.
It's getting messy.
It's all getting messy.
It is.
He has the high idealism in the first 3/4 of his letters, and then it's just like, all right, let's get really down to what this means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. And then here's the tension. It's meeting people where they're at. It's getting messy, but it's not leaving them where they are.
No.
It's also then leading them into something new and life-giving.
Yeah.
So there is another tension, and that'll always be a tension.
Yeah.
So the people are never going to be fixed. They're always going to be broken and messy, but don't leave them broken and messy. Try to fix them. Do you know what I mean? There's that tension going on. And I just think of Jesus' table ministry, where he sits with the prostitutes and the outcasts and the sinners. He meets them where they're at, but he doesn't leave them there. He draws them towards healing.
Yeah.
So there's a deep tension there.
Yeah. So that's it.
That's awesome.
Tensions to manage.
That's great, man.
Potentially rather than problems to solve.
Yeah.
Yes, there are problems that need to be solved, but mostly it seems like there's a lot of tensions to be managed.
Yeah.
And how do you do that well? I don't know. Hopefully we gave you something to think about. So this is Lunch on the Way podcast, and Jonathan, you helped come up with the name. So what's Lunch on the Way? What's our purpose?
Oh, that's it. Thanks, mate.
Why do we have conversations?
We have conversations because theology and God and life it's not complicated, but it's complex, and we're here to tease that open with each other and to hear from each other and learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what's so good about a conversation, Graham?
Well, I'm curious. I have this assumption that most human beings are. And so the conversation opens the box on curiosity in a way that's stimulating, interesting, and a way in which I can learn and grow. So I find that really helpful. Wisdom's percolating all around the space.
Yeah. And the conversation never ends.
Joey,
Yeah.
what do
Yeah.
you love most about these conversations?
Well, what I love is that I don't really know what we're getting ourselves into when we first talk. And so what that means...
That's why we
That's
don't
true.
put some online, is it?
Yeah. And so what that means is I think any conclusions that we arrive at aren't really conclusions for me.
Yeah.
They're just kind of stepping stones towards
Yeah.
something else.
Yeah.
And so we kind of hold these conversations loosely and lightly. So if there's anything that we say that you're like, oh, this is what this person believes now, if it's outside of orthodoxy, if it's not the big pillars of the faith, then we're willing to have our minds changed. So don't take everything we say as our definitive opinion.
No.
Just, if Jesus is raised from the dead, we'll start from there and work our way out.
Sounds awesome.